Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning for this GERAD seminar. Today we have the pleasure of having Lesia Mitridati, and she'll be presenting her work on the cost of privacy in the coordination of heat and electricity markets. So for background, Lesia is now a postdoctoral researcher at ETH Zurich. And prior to that, she was in Georgia Tech. And again, prior to that, she did her PhD at DTU at the Denmark Technical University. And for the story, I met Lesia while she was doing her external stay, where I did my PhD, that is in Toronto. So we'll have a presentation of about 45-50 minutes. And you can then ask questions on the chat, so we can keep that in mind, and then we'll have a question session towards the end. So thank you, everyone, and thanks, Lesia, for being with us. So the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Yes, so it's also okay with me if you have a pressing question, something you don't understand in the slides, if you want to ask it right away. It's better to set everything on the table than having me continue on something that's not clear. So Antoine mentioned my, I guess, past universities, and this work that I'm going to present is actually has been a collaboration with many people. It started at DTU with my supervisors, Pierre Pinson and Jalal Kazempour. It's then carried on with Ferdinando Fioretto and Pascal van Hettenrich at Georgia Tech. And now it's still going on with Gabriela Hug at ETH Zurich. And also one of my students who's been involved, who is Emma Romay. So I just wanted to acknowledge also their contribution to this work. I guess to start with the background and the motivation for this work. With the increase of renewables and the power system, there's also an increasing need for flexibility and operational flexibility. And this came hand in hand with also the increase of interconnection between the power system and other energy carriers. So in particular, I'm thinking of natural gas system, since there's an increase of gas-fired power plants in the power system, but also in many countries such as Nordic countries and Denmark, but also China, there is an increased interaction with the heating system through large-scale district heating networks that are connected with the power system through heat pumps of combined heat and power plants. So there are synergies between these systems that can be harnessed. And the objective of this work was to coordinate those energy systems in a market environment. So in particular, during this talk, I'm going to use the example of heat and electricity markets, but I will also mention when there are some similarities with other markets, including natural gas markets. So the motivation to coordinate heat and electricity systems is that the large penetration of combined heated power plants and heat pumps at the interface between both systems can create some operational flexibility for the power system, and also that the flexibility of large district heating networks and pipelines can provide virtual electricity storage for the power system. So the objective was to design a new heat market framework that could harness this flexibility and provide more flexibility to the power system. So currently in many Nordic countries, district heating and electricity systems are operated by two independent and sequential market operators. So this is the example of Denmark, where the district heating market operator is called Varmelast in Copenhagen. And this market is cleared before, under their head, before the day-ahead electricity market. So all CHPs and heat pumps must place their price and quantity offers in the heat market. Once they are dispatched, then they can participate in the electricity market and place their bids there in the Nord Pool day-ahead market. Because those CHPs and heat pumps participate in both markets, they create some interdependencies between both markets. And the first one is that the joint feasible operating region links their heat and electricity production. So you can see on this graph on the left, the heat production and electricity production of a CHP. And you can see that they can produce heat and electricity at different ratios. Now, heat pumps can produce heat from electricity at a fixed ratio. So if you add this heat pump to the feasible operating region of a CHP, you can see that you can increase the total joint feasible operating region of the district heating network. And then if you also consider heat water tank storage or district heating network storage, then you can again increase the flexibility of the district heating network. So this can be a source of flexibility when operating the heat system to keep in mind. However, since right now the heat market is cleared before the electricity market and is myopic to what is happening in the power system, this can actually limit the flexibility of CHPs and heat pumps when they participate in the electricity market. So you can see here two examples of a heat production dispatch for one CHP that would considerably change their electricity production bounds, especially their minimum electricity production when they will participate then in the electricity market. So this is the first limitation of this sequential and decoupled market framework. The second interaction that happens between both markets is that the heat production cost of CHPs and heat pumps depends on the electricity prices that come from the electricity market and therefore are still unknown when the heat market is cleared. So for a heat pump, since they produce heat from electricity at a fixed ratio, you can see on this green curve that their marginal heat production cost is linear function of the electricity prices at which they purchase electricity. On the other hand, CHPs have varying ratios of heat and electricity. So for low electricity prices, the heat marginal cost represents the cost of producing 1 more units of heat when the electricity production is at the minimum power to heat ratio, so along this line. So when the electricity price increases, this marginal heat production cost decreases because they can make more revenues on the electricity market. So then relatively the cost of producing heat decreases. But then when electricity prices keep increasing past this threshold, the marginal heat production cost of CHPs represents actually an opportunity loss of producing 1 more unit of heat, which would result in reducing their electricity production at the maximum power to heat ratio along this line. So you can see that this, this marginal heat production cost can be represented typically as piecewise linear function of the electricity market prices. Which means that when the heat market is cleared, to minimize the heat production cost, the heat market must anticipate what the electricity prices will be when the electricity market is cleared. So this type of bidirectional interactions between both markets is typical of a Stackelberg game. So just a little background on generic Stackelberg game. So in a Stackelberg game, we have 2 players that play sequentially. The first one to play will be called the leader, and the second one, the follower. So each player tries to maximize their own profit or minimize their own cost through their own decision variables. But what happens is that the action of the leader will impact the reaction of the follower by changing the feasible space and the constraints of the follower. And in turn, the reaction of the follower will impact the objective cost of the leader. So this means that when the leader is trying to optimize its own cost, it must anticipate on the impact of its action on the follower and on the reaction of the follower. Now, to come back to heat and electricity markets, I was explaining in the coordination framework that we propose is to have a heat market that would be aware of the electricity market. So this electricity aware heat market is the leader and tries to minimize the heat production cost by dispatching CHPs, heat pumps, and heat-only units, while anticipating the impact of the heat dispatch of CHPs and heat pumps on the electricity market clearing, and in turn, the impact of the electricity prices on its own objective through the heat production cost of CHPs and heat pumps. So the first proposal was to redesign the heat market so that it could directly account for this bidirectional interaction, and to model the heat market as a Stackelberg game using a hierarchical optimization problem. So in this optimization problem, the leader, which is the heat market, tried to minimize its heat production cost as a function of its own primal decision variables, which are the heat dispatch, and as a function of the electricity prices, which are the dual variables of the electricity market. It has a set of linear constraints, which represents typically balance equation and minimum and maximum production of all the units in the heat system. And it models the dual variables of, it models the electricity prices directly as the dual variables of the electricity market, which is a lower level problem embedded in the constraints of the upper level. So we model this lower level also as a linear optimization problem, which minimizes the electricity production cost this time, subject to a set of linear constraints that represent balance equation and electricity production of all the market participants. And we notice that those linear constraints are dependent on the heat dispatch, which comes from the upper level, so from the heat market. Now, in this specific market application, as I was saying, we can model the heat production cost of the units as piecewise. So the marginal production cost of CHPs and heat pumps are piecewise linear function of the electricity prices. And we model the electricity production cost and the objective of the electricity market clearing as linear costs. So this, to actually solve this bilevel optimization problem, what we do is first we reformulate this lower level problem using its KKT conditions. And then we linearize these bilinear terms in the upper levels objective function exactly, actually using the strong duality and KKT condition of the lower level problem. We're able to reformulate this as linear, piecewise linear functions. So now we can reformulate this as a mixed integral linear problem and solve this using classic solvers. So what we want to do is to compare this electricity aware heat market to the traditional decoupled market. So in the traditional decoupled market, the heat market does not model the electricity prices directly as a variable of its own problem, but it uses an estimate or forecast of the electricity prices. And so this would represent our base case and what is currently done in the markets. And then since we want to compare also our model to best case scenario, we also compare it to an integrated approach in which heat and electricity systems are cleared jointly. So the objective is to minimize both the heat and electricity production costs, and subject to the constraints on heat and electricity production and heat and electricity balance. So our electricity-aware model is somewhat close to the decoupled model because it still happens in 2 steps, which means that the heat market is cleared first, and then when it's decided, the electricity market is going to be cleared. Whereas this integrated model is a best case scenario, but is quite unrealistic because it would require completely merging the market operators across different geographical areas at different energy carriers. So this can only be considered as a best case scenario to compare our model. So we compared those 3 models on an IEEE modified 24-bus system. We coupled this power system to 2 isolated 3-node district heating systems. So in each district heating system, we have 1 CHP and 1 heat pump, which interfaces with the power system at different nodes. And we ran a simulation over 1 year using some historical data from Node Pool and some forecast of wind production over this year. And we conducted multiple simulations for different wind capacity in the power system, ranging from 32% of the electricity peak load to 138% capacity, wind capacity compared to the electricity peak load. And just for a comparison, in Denmark, in the past few years, there have been multiple hours where there was more wind production than the actual electricity load. So it's not uncommon that the wind production in Denmark is higher than 100% of the electricity consumption. So what we noticed in those simulations, so in those figures, you can see for different values of the installed wind capacity. On the left, you can see the electricity production cost for 3 models. In the middle, you can see the heat production cost of the 3 models. And then on the right, you can see the total production cost with the 3 models. So what we can see is that, so for all values of wind penetration, the electricity-aware performs better than our decoupled model. So it does reduce the operating cost both in the electricity system and in the heat system, and also overall. So here in the table below, you can see in percentage of difference compared to the best case integrated market, the performance of both the sequential decoupled market and our electricity-aware market. So you can see that the electricity-aware market significantly reduces the cost, especially for low values or medium values of the wind penetration. Now, the other thing that actually happens is that when we increase the wind penetration in the power system, and therefore we also increase uncertainty because the heat market does not have full information or full forecast of the wind production in the electricity market in this model, we can see that the cost and the performance of the electricity-aware market compared to the ideal integrated market that has full information and clears the market jointly decreases. So this also tells us that one limitation of this model is that the more uncertainty we have on the clearing of the electricity market, the the lower the improvements that we can achieve compared to an integrated energy market. So this also tells us that this approach is great to achieve coordination between two sequential markets, as long as you have perfect or very good information on the data and the input parameters of the follower. So in this case, in the electricity market. So this requires the exchange of information from the follower to the leader, so that the leader can anticipate the impact of its decisions on the follower. And if we don't have this, this exchange of information, this can deteriorate the performance of this Stackelberg game. Now, some of this information for the follower might be sensitive, and they might be reluctant to share this information. So in particular, in the power system, the time series of the individual consumers' loads can be considered as some sensitive data that the follower does not want to share with the leader before the market clearing. So this might deteriorate the performance of the Stackelberg mechanism. This is why a continuation of this work has been to develop what we called privacy-preserving Stackelberg mechanism. In this mechanism, we add one step before the clearing of the markets, which aims at protecting the sensitive data of the follower before it can be shared with the leader. So this PPSM, as we called it, has two goals. The first goal is a privacy goal. So the main goal of this mechanism is to protect the sensitive data of the follower in a Stackelberg game before they can share it with the leader. The second goal is a fidelity goal, which is that the privacy-preserving data that will be exchanged with the leader must still guarantee that the solution of the leader and the follower's problems compared to the original solutions of the Stackelberg game with the original data must be close to the original solutions. Otherwise, this deteriorates the performance of the coordination and we achieve a suboptimal coordination. To achieve this first privacy goal, we use the framework of differential privacy. So to reframe this privacy goal in the context of differential privacy, what we actually want to achieve is to protect variations on the sensitive data of the follower up to a certain level of indistinguishability that we'll call alpha. This definition relies on the definition of what we call adjacent data sets. So two data sets are called alpha adjacent if they differ at most by one element, and if their elements that differ at most by a level alpha, which is the level of indistinguishability and represents the level of privacy that we want to protect between two data sets. So the higher this alpha, the more privacy we protect intuitively. Now, with this definition of privacy that we want to protect and adjacent data sets, we consider that differentially private mechanism achieves what is called epsilon differential privacy if for any adjacent data sets, the outcomes of the mechanism when observed by an attacker are indistinguishable. This means that I apply my mechanism to those two data sets, and the outcomes when an observer, an attacker can only observe these outcomes. They cannot distinguish between the two original data sets. And we introduce a privacy loss, epsilon, which represents how much privacy can be protected by this mechanism. So now This is a classical definition of differential privacy that is used mostly for protecting single data points in data sets. Now, in our case, as I was explaining, the data that we might want to protect are time series that might be correlated over different hours for each individual consumers. So to protect this data, we need to slightly augment this definition of privacy and this privacy goal. And so our privacy goal for these time series, or we can also call them data streams, is to protect variation of the sensitive data up to a certain level of indistinguishability and within a predefined time window of length W. So we extend the definition also of alpha adjacent data sets to what we call W neighboring data stream prefixes. So a data stream prefix is indexed by a time t, and it represents all the events in this data set that happened up to this time t. So we consider that two data stream prefixes are W neighbors if all their events up to this time are pairwise alpha adjacent. And also if all the different events, all the events that are actually differing between those data stream prefixes are within a time window of up to W time steps. So with this definition, W represents the time window within which we protect the data. And then we can also extend the definition of a differentially private randomized mechanism if when it's applied to data stream prefixes, then the outcome of the randomized mechanism are indistinguishable for an attacker up to a certain privacy loss budget. So this epsilon privacy loss, the smaller this value, the more private the mechanism is. So now that we have this definition of what privacy goal we actually want to achieve, there's quite a lot of research on differential privacy and different randomized mechanisms that are differentially private. We know specifically that the Laplace mechanism, so when applied to data stream prefixes, if we apply to each one of those the events in this data stream prefix independent Laplace noise with a scale W times alpha, then we know that this randomized mechanism satisfies W privacy on those data streams. So the first steps of our w-PPSM is to obfuscate the sensitive data of the follower using this Laplace mechanism. So the first step is just to add noise to this sensitive data. Now, the main challenge is that this perturbed data, when used as inputs for optimization problems with some strong physical constraints, might lead to infeasible problems, but also solutions of those optimization problems that are very far from the optimal original solution, both for the leader and the follower. So then this would lead to suboptimal coordination of the systems or infeasible solutions for the system. So the proposal and the fidelity goal that we're trying to achieve with this w-PPSM is to bound the impact of the differentially private mechanism on the objective value of the leader and the follower. And this difference in the cost, in the optimal objective cost of the leader and the follower before and after we apply the PPSM mechanism So this difference is what we call the cost of privacy of the mechanism. So our goal is to restore fidelity after the Laplace obfuscation to bound this cost of privacy. So to do that, we add a second phase to our w-PPSM mechanism, which is a fidelity recovery phase. So the goal of this fidelity recovery phase is to redistribute the noise that has been introduced on the sensitive data by the Laplace mechanism in an optimal way. And what we want to ensure is that this new privacy-preserving data will ensure fidelity of the solution of the Stackelberg game compared to the original solutions. And the way we actually enforce this in practice is using an optimization-based approach. So what we're trying to find is the optimal privacy-preserving data, which is denoted D hat, such that it minimizes the distance with respect to the obfuscated data. That is the data after the Laplace mechanism has been applied. So we look for this new privacy-preserving data that also ensures fidelity with respect to the original follower's cost. So using the original data, what would have been the cost of the follower, this optimal cost, we want to restore fidelity of the solution after the PPSM using this privacy-preserving data with respect to this original data. Since we considered in order to be as general as possible, that we didn't directly have access to this original cost, but that we had access to a forecast of estimates of this original cost. So we add a constraint to recover fidelity on this estimate of the original cost within a certain parameter beta that bounds the fidelity. Then the second constraint that these privacy-preserving data must ensure is that we want to restore fidelity with respect to the original leader's objective cost. Now, since when the follower is devising this mechanism to share its data, it doesn't have access to the leader's data to compute its original cost, or even to compute its cost after the PPSM has been applied. So the only thing that the follower can actually do is to ensure fidelity on its own variables, but on the variables that will impact the cost of the leader. So in the Stackelberg game that we looked at, the cost of the leader, which was the heat production cost, was a function of the electricity prices, which are the dual variables of the follower. So we enforce a second fidelity constraint on the dual variables of the follower, or at least on an estimate of those original dual variables. So we have two fidelity constraints that this data must, this new privacy-preserving data must fulfill. And we define those, this cost of the follower after the PPSM and this dual variable of the follower after the PPSM as the optimal solution of the follower's problem with this new privacy-preserving data. This way, what we're trying to do is to find a new optimal privacy-preserving data that will ensure that after the PPSM, the cost of the follower and the cost of the leader will be as close as possible to the original cost, while still preserving privacy on this data. So after we've enforced this mechanism, we have access to new privacy-preserving data that we can communicate to the leader. And now, so just to summarize, I guess, those steps in the w-PPSM, first, the follower will obfuscate its sensitive data using the w-PPSM algorithm. So the two phases, the privacy and the fidelity recovery phases. Then the follower will share this new privacy preserving data with the leader, and the leader will solve its problem. So using this new privacy preserving data. We've talked about our privacy and fidelity goals, and some work that has been done has been to try to derive actually theoretical properties on those goals. So the first theoretical property that our w-PPSM actually achieves is that it achieves w-privacy. So it achieves the same level of privacy as the Laplace mechanism with which we've obfuscated the data initially. And that can be explained because one important property of differential privacy is that it is immune to post-processing. So after some data has been obfuscated with a differentially private mechanism, any operations that I've done on this data without accessing the original data will guarantee the same level of privacy. So in this sense, our fidelity recovery phase, since it doesn't directly access the original data, but only accesses and does computations on public data or the obfuscated data, then that guarantees that overall the w-PPSM achieves the same privacy guarantees as the Laplace mechanism. Now, the benefits of this w-PPSM compared to the Laplace mechanism is that we've tried to restore fidelity. So what about the fidelity goals of this mechanism? So to derive actually bounds on the fidelity of this mechanism, first we have to, discuss a little bit more some of the assumptions and some of the data that we used in this w-PPSM. So I mentioned that to be as generic as possible, we assumed that we did not have access to the original solutions of the Stackelberg game. And that is because it could be conceived that accessing those optimal solutions, even though we're not accessing the original data, could present a privacy leakage risk. So what we've assumed is that we still had forecasting tools that could privately forecast these original solutions. And we've made the assumption that this forecasting was accurate up to some parameters gamma for each one of those values. So the values that we need to forecast are the solutions, the decision variables of leader and follower, and the optimal costs of the follower. And within a certain probability 1 minus p, we assume that this estimate is accurate. So based on the accuracy of this estimation and also the parameters in the fidelity recovery phase, then we can derive bounds on the cost of privacy for both the leader and the follower. So first of all, for the follower, after the w-PPSM has been applied, we can bound the cost of privacy for the follower as a constant value that depends on the fidelity parameter and the estimate accuracy on the cost of the follower. So this shows us that actually the follower has a lot of control to bound its cost of privacy after w-PPSM. Now, once the follower then communicates its privacy preserving data to the leader and the leader solves its problem with this data, we can also derive bounds on how much this privacy preserving data will impact the cost of the leader. And this So these bounds can be expressed as piecewise bilinear function of the solutions, the original solutions of the leader, and the error introduced on the electricity prices. And so in a way, this is somehow related to the expression of the leader's cost, which was a bilinear, piecewise bilinear function of the electricity prices and the dispatch, the heat dispatch. So we see a similar impact on the bounds and the cost of privacy for the leader, where we can see that it depends on here the fidelity and estimate error on the dual variables of the follower, which are the electricity prices, and also on the dispatch of the leader in the optimal and privacy preserving phases. So now that we've derived some theoretical bounds for the impact of this w-PPSM on the leader and the follower, we've also done some numerical validations to see in practice which cost we actually achieve. So we used a similar system as the one that we used for the Stackelberg game. We have 24-bus system with 2 district heating networks. We did a simulation over 1 typical day, and we used the following heat loads and electricity loads and wind production that is overall average around 700 megawatt hour. In this system, we compare first the Laplace mechanism and the w-PPSM. So the first thing that we notice, so this table shows us for different values of the indistinguishability parameter. So for the smallest one, which represents the lowest privacy to the highest privacy, which is 100. So we compare the error introduced on the privacy preserving data and the cost of privacy for the leader and the follower expressed as a percentage of the original costs. The first thing we observe is that the indistinguishability parameter, since it directly impacts how much noise is added to the data in the Laplace mechanism, it directly impacts how much the error introduced on the sensitive data, whereas for our Laplace mechanism, we still manage to bound indirectly how much noise and the error on this sensitive data. Now, with respect to the cost of the leader, we can see that for higher values of the indistinguishability parameter, the Laplace mechanism, the cost of privacy on the leader increases drastically as alpha increases. So this means that there's a trade-off of the Laplace mechanism of how much privacy we can ensure versus how much fidelity we can provide for the leader. This is not a problem that we observe for the PPSM mechanism, as it manages to keep those errors on the leader's cost bounded. Now, for the follower, what we observe for both mechanisms is actually when we increase the indistinguishability parameter in both models, the error, the followers, the cost of privacy of the follower actually slightly decreases. So this tells us that privacy is actually beneficial to the leader, to the follower, and this can be explained by thinking that the leader somehow has a strategic advantage over the follower because it has access to all its data, so it can optimize its own cost, knowing exactly how the follower will react. Now, when you remove this perfect information and you provide an obfuscated data, then you reduce the strategic advantage of the leader. And that actually has been used for mechanism design using differential privacy to ensure truthfulness, for example, in mechanism designs. So now we also studied actually the impact of different operating conditions in the heat and electricity systems on the cost of privacy. So here you can see a figure that shows, vertically, we have varied the heat load in this typical day by plus minus 60%. And horizontally, we've varied the electricity load uniformly in this typical day between minus 50% and plus 100%. So this shows us different operating conditions in the system. And we've applied, again, the Laplace and w-PPSM mechanisms and observed the cost of privacy in each one of those operating conditions for an distributability parameter of 100. So what we can see is that the Laplace mechanism achieves usually way higher cost of privacy for the leader, but also that actually we can identify some operating condition in which the cost of privacy for the leader is much higher compared to other operating conditions. And in particular, that happens when the heat load is fairly low. And that makes sense because it's expressed in percentage of the original cost. So the original cost of the leader is fairly low for low heat loads. And the cost of the CHPs and heat pumps represents a big share of this original cost. So slightly changing the cost of heat pumps and CHPs then will result respectively in a higher cost of privacy in the heat market. Now, this also increases this cost of privacy for the leader when electricity load increases. And this can be explained thinking that for higher electricity loads, the electricity prices, the sensitivity of the electricity prices might be higher. Slightly changing the dispatch of one CHP might lead to turning on some peak load generator, which will then increase the electricity prices greatly. And then this will lead to a big difference in the cost of the CHP and therefore on the cost of the leader. So these cases where the cost of the leader, the cost of privacy for the leader is higher, represents some suboptimal coordination. Now, if we do the same analysis for the follower, we also can observe some patterns. We observe that the cost of privacy for the follower is actually the highest for high heat loads and low electricity loads. So this can be explained because for low electricity loads, the participation of CHPs and heat pumps represents a big share of the production. So a small change in their dispatch will impact the electricity dispatch greatly. And also for high electricity loads, those CHPs and heat pumps will be turned on to produce this heat. So a small change then in their dispatch will also lead to higher cost of privacy. So for the w-PPSM, it's really hard to see because of the orders of magnitude difference between the two mechanisms. But we actually observe similar variations, but much, much smaller variations. So just to conclude, I forgot to say that, yes, so those conditions where the cost of privacy for the follower is higher represent, in the point of view of the follower, some operating condition where there is a higher risk associated to privacy leakage for the follower. So to summarize, so we've presented a Stackelberg game mechanism to ensure coordination between sequential energy markets while preserving their sequential clearing. We've also noted that one main limitation is that it requires the exchange of sensitive information between the leader and the follower, and this can be unrealistic in some cases. So to facilitate this exchange and still achieve coordination, we've introduced the w-PPSM mechanism, which protects the sensitive data of the follower while aiming at ensuring a close to optimal coordination between the leader and the follower which are the sequential heat and electricity markets. Now, future work will focus on reducing the privacy budget when we have to repeat this operation over multiple days. And a way that we've identified to do this is to try to identify and classify different operating conditions based on how much risk they present if there is a privacy leakage, and based on this classification to dynamically adapt how much noise is added on the sensitive data, meaning that when there's less privacy leakage, we don't need to add, to use the w-PPSM, where we can communicate these data without a risk associated with it. Whereas when there is a higher risk of privacy leakage for the follower, we can then adapt and increase the noise added to the sensitive data. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you have some questions, either now or by email, if you want to contact me. Thank you.